Hey, welcome back to Inspirify News. I'm Ted Gover. Thanks for being here. Our guest today is Dr. Traci Parker. She is Graduate Program Director and Associate Professor at W.E. Du Bois Department of African American Studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And she's the author of an impactful book on an important chapter in the civil rights movement entitled Department Stores and the Black Freedom Movement, Workers, Consumers, and Civil Rights. It's important to repeat book titles, I believe. And so let me say it again. Professor Parker's book title is entitled Department Stores and the Black Freedom Movement, Workers, Consumers, and Civil Rights. Professor Parker teaches courses on African American women's history, 19th and 20th century US history, race and racism, class, labor, capitalism, and consumer culture. Follow Professor Parker on Twitter at Traci Lynn, NEA. So that's at Mark, TraciLynnea. Professor Parker, it's great to be with you.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the wonderful introduction.
Well, when I learned of your book, I resolved to read it and speak with you. And during our tumultuous times, people like you who help us to learn from history are as important as ever. So I really thank you for your work.
Well, thank you.
You have written beautifully about the movement to integrate white collar work and consumption in American department stores. And for those who have yet to read your important book, Department Stores and the Black Freedom Movement, it discusses the 1960 lunch counter sit-ins that helped to desegregate eating facilities. Question, who were the Greensboro Four who engaged in the lunch counter sit-ins at Woolworths in February of 1960? And could you please remind our audience where Greensboro is, and why did these four young men choose Woolworths as the site of their lunch counter sit-ins?
Sure. So the Greensboro Four, or the Greensboro Sit-In, was launched on February 1st, 1960. And these are four young gentlemen who were attending a historically Black college university in North Carolina. Um, and so they choose the Woolworths because they had themselves had experienced the injustice, racial discrimination, segregation in the public sphere. But they also were inspired by the fact that they were part of the youth NAACP, their local youth NAACP. And one of them, in fact, had actually seen Dr. King come to speak years prior on the importance of the civil rights movement and the importance of leveraging nonviolence tactics for ending racial discrimination and segregation. And so on February 4th, they planned and executed a lunch counter sit-in. And it is while they're sitting at the Woolworths counter that they really do begin to change the direction of the movement, right? It's something that sounds so silly that they go to Woolworths, purchase some other items, right? One, I believe, purchased a notebook, showing that African Americans at the time could purchase items in other departments in stores and retail establishments, and then went to the eating facility, which was the lunch counter, and they were not served. And what they were demonstrating was the hypocrisy, the contradictions of capitalism, the hypocrisy and contradictions of American democracy. And they did so just by the simple act of sitting, not starting any violence, not starting any fanfare, but just waiting to be served. And their actions kicked off a number of sitting movements throughout the South thereafter. In fact, historians often credit that movement with help spurring, kicking off the student movement of the civil rights.
What were the reactions to the sit-ins by the local community, both Black and white? And how soon did it take for the sit-ins to spread?
So the sit-in spread almost immediately. So it's the four gentlemen who come sit on February 1st. They're joined, I think, if I remember correctly, about 50 other students come the following day. And then soon it's hundreds. And within days, It's now spread to other cities throughout North Carolina and then soon throughout the South. One of the more notable sit-in movements that I speak of, which might not be notable to the public, but certainly notable for folks who study the civil rights movement, is the Charlotte sit-in movement that began February 9th of 1960, which is just 8 days after the sit-in movement in Greensboro, North Carolina. And that movement, to me, is notable because it is a movement that not only integrated public accommodations, right, the lunch counter, but it also integrated white collar work in these retail establishments.
There were other sit-ins that occurred 10 years before. I think even also there were sit-ins in the 1940s. Why did the sit-ins at Woolworths generate so much attention? And can you share with us a little bit about the economic impact it had?
Oh, sure. So you're correct. There were sit-ins that happened before 1960s. The sit-in movement that occurs in 1960 that helps bring about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, another major leading civil rights organization at the time, built on a long history of African Americans leveraging their purchasing power. Right? So throughout the 20th century, increasingly, as African Americans are moving to urban centers, as they're becoming more waged, right? More of them are finding jobs in factories, more and more becoming employed as domestics. More of them are living in urban centers such as Chicago and New York. And they're also becoming more educated. So we're talking about a community that was moving from the rural South, where Black children were going to school not on a regular basis, and certainly not all year round. That they're getting to urban centers like Chicago and New York, and they're becoming more educated. They're able to attend school for the entire school year. So this combination of being more urban, waged, and educated helps bring about a movement, or at least, let me back up. It creates an African-American communities, urban communities, who have more purchasing power, right? They've got more money to spend in the consumer sphere. And they're learning that they need to leverage their money in this sphere. That they recognize the contradictions, again, of American democracy, that these retail institutions, while they may welcome them to shop, that they also obeyed the tenets of Jim Crow in many ways. So, in addition to not being able to eat at lunch counters, they weren't able to patronize the hair salons or the barber shops that were in a lot of these retail establishments, especially department stores, most notably. They're not able to work as sales workers or office workers. They're relegated to jobs that most closely align with domestic work or manual work. And so they understand that merchants will act when their profits are being affected. And so that's why you do see consumer boycotts, consumer protests occurring decades before the 1960 sit-in movement, right? So the most notable ones are going to be the Don't Buy Where You Can't Work movement of the 1930s. Pauli Murray participates in one. She leads one with Howard University students in Washington, D.C. in early 1940s. And I should also add that a key part of these protests is not only the boycott, but also the sit-in, which they pull from the labor movement of the 1930s, which many African Americans had been involved in.
Again, we're with Professor Traci Parker of the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She is the author of Department Stores and the Black Freedom Movement. Professor Parker, were there any national civil rights organizations that helped the Greensboro Four, that helped this movement? What type of support did they have, if any?
So the NAACP has certainly become supportive of this movement. But as I mentioned, the major organization that becomes supportive of the sit-in movement is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And these are those college students who were participating in sit-ins, who drew on this legacy of leveraging Black purchasing power and labor power, but also were very influenced by an older generation of civil rights activists that would have been the Mamie Till generation. So, and what I mean by that is that these students would have been of the Emmett Till generation. So
Mm.
Mamie Till was his mother. And they were greatly influenced, in particular, by Ella Baker, who was a civil rights activist who had affiliations with the Communist Party and the labor movement during the 1930s, who had been part of the NAACP, um, and who had criticisms of the way in which the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, operated. Specifically, she criticized the top-down approach of that. And so the student nonviolent coordinating movement obeys, it embraces, it celebrates what they call participatory democracy, meaning that everyone should have a say, should have an equal and fair say. And that's really how those four gentlemen organized the Greensboro sit-in. Right? The four of them had a mutual say and decision in how it would go about. There's certain stories of them taking votes about being very democratic about their approach and when they would do it, and they would take votes among themselves. But the idea is that everyone would be heard, and so this is what they really are influenced by, and this is the ideology, the practice in which they celebrate and embrace.
What were the agreed upon tactics of the sit-ins and in their overall approach?
So each sit-in, I would say, because there's a local aspect to it, had their own different goals and desires. But the overarching goal was to end racial discrimination, segregation, and public accommodations. The idea, and not only public accommodations, but downtown spaces in which they were located. So Woolworths is important to this story because it's a chain retailer. The idea is that these four men were conscious, they may not have articulated this, but what's key is that these four men sought to integrate a retail establishment that had locations in New York, right? As far north as New York, as far west as California. And so they could model a type of protest that could be successful in various spots throughout the country. And it's important to note, too, that these retail establishments often took on the racial cues, the racial order of its locale. So if the Woolworths is in North Carolina, for example, they don't allow African Americans to sit in at its lunch counter. In Chicago, the story, however, might be much different, right? The racial status quo, the Woolworths on the south side of Chicago would allow African Americans to sit in at its lunch counter. And so the goals are different depending on place. So, you find, for example, in the 1940s and 1950s, when African Americans are challenging Jim Crow and retail establishments in Chicago, they're more focused on labor. They're more focused on integrating white collar work of sales and office work at the time. They are still concerned with racially discriminatory customer service practices, but oftentimes that's based on how individuals are being treated, right? The type of service they might receive. For example, oftentimes they would find that if you were an African American customer who walked into a white-owned establishment, which was likely in a downtown, let's say downtown Chicago, if a white person came behind you, right, you were already there with your items and you're ready to make a purchase or you're ready to inquire about a piece of merchandise, but a white customer comes up behind you, maybe 10 minutes later, they would stop waiting on an African American customer and go wait on a white customer. That was sort of the racial custom of Northern department stores. And so what they were demanding was not simply the ability to eat in these eateries, these restaurants, lunch counters. They're also asking for fair and equal treatment as customers, but also as workers.
By the time of the lunch counter sit-ins in Greensboro, which took place in 1960, it was already some 5, 6 years after Brown v. Board of Education. What was the state of racial segregation in North Carolina at the time in 1960?
So in 1960, North Carolina would have been celebrated and it saw itself as a racially moderate state. When the Brown versus Board of Education decision comes through, many North Carolinians are ready to accept the Brown versus Board of Education decision. Now, they don't, right? It's still a struggle to integrate schools. But they begrudgingly understand that this was a Supreme Court decision and they were going to have to change their education policies. This comes to pretty much a standstill, however. Right? There's efforts to do so. There's a couple of instances, and I would call it tokenism, where African American students are placed into white schools and integrating white schools. But for the most part, there's no widespread real desegregation of the education system. And this is what these four young men are observing, right? These four young men who spark the student sit-in movement. What they're observing is the fact that the movement, the civil rights movement, was sort of at a low, right? We go from the Brown versus Board of Education decision. There's a Little Rock Nine in 1957, which is a few years later, but there's no major movement that has happened between 57 and 60. These are also students who would have been, as I mentioned earlier, part of the Emmett Till generation. So we're talking about students who had been, or young men who had been very much moved, impacted by the murder of this young man in Money, Mississippi in 1955. And so North Carolina is a place where you could say would be more open to racial desegregation, which is characteristically different than, let's say, Mississippi or Alabama, which the color line seems to be much more hard and fast, but it's still a segregated state that has embraced and it obeys everything that is Jim Crow.
How long did the lunch counter sit-ins last? Did they take place on a daily basis? And if so, how many hours each day?
So students would get there when the stores open. They would leave when the stores closed. Depending on the location, it would take, some of them took a couple of months. In the case of Charlotte, North Carolina, that movement started in early February of 1960. Most of the downtown retail establishments integrated its eating facilities by July of 1960. However, the one holdout was Sears, Roebuck and Company, which took until October of 1960. So we're talking about these usually lasted a span of months. And in that span, retailers lost hundreds of thousands of dollars to the point where they could no longer afford to have these sit-ins carry on. And this is what compels many of them to integrate their spaces, their shopping and eating spaces. They don't do it out of humanistic interest. They do it out of economic interest.
For those who participated in the sit-ins, what type of treatment did they endure during the sit-ins themselves?
Oh, they were, well, from white Southerners who would have been segregationists, they were treated to violence, threats of death, very extreme forms of violence. We're talking about students sitting in at lunch counters having hot coffee poured, being hit in the face, being spit in the face. Among Black communities, for example, in Greensboro, it took a little bit of time for the older generation to come around, right? The most immediate response was often from other college students who immediately would show their support, would show up to participate in the sit-ins, whether they sat down at the lunch counter or picketed storefronts. But sometimes you would have older church members who would organize carpools to give students rides to downtown. Sometimes you had older members of the community participate in the sit-ins themselves. Oftentimes you had members of the community who were very much church affiliated. These were church members, their parents, their aunts, their uncles, their grandparents, who would help collect money together, right? They would donate money, they would collect money, they would make sandwiches for these young adults. But there are also instances, like in the Greensboro sit-in, where you start to see more and more white Southerners who are siding with sit-ins. So in the case of Greensboro, for example, the women's college at UNC, several of their students, white women, who came downtown to participate in the lunch counter sit-in, to lend their support, either picketing or sitting in at the lunch counter.
There was a football team that some of the players played a role in the sit-ins, did they not? Can you share with us a little bit about that?
I can. So that actually involves those young women who were coming from UNC. These women had come down to the lunch counter to participate in the Greensboro sit-in, and they start to be verbally attacked by segregationists. And it's the football players who protect them and help escort them out of the Woolworths.
The four students who started the Greensboro lunch counter sit-ins, the Greensboro Four, what came of them? What work did they end up doing afterwards?
So some of them went on to continue civil rights labors. One, and forgive me, I'm forgetting his name right now. He found that participating in the sit-in had some dire effects, right? He was always linked to the sit-in, and so he found that he was never able really to move up professionally when it came to his career. But they all, I mean, based on all of the interviews that I have read, that I have watched, they were all very proud of the work that they did.
Can you set the stage for us in terms of what were the rules for African American consumers at department stores in the South in the 1960s? Everything from using, beauty stores, accessing credit, trying on clothes. Can you share with us what it was like for them?
So this is why I find department stores so amazing, right? So we have one side of department stores that if you're an African American customer, it offered an alternative, and I'm talking about very early in the 20th century, of using dry goods or the local general store, where you would encounter way more racial discrimination. Department stores came to the fore, became leaders or vanguards of American retailing by the turn of the 20th century. And if you were living in an urban center in particular, folks would patronize these stores. And they were fantastic, right? We're talking about establishments that offered numerous services and amenities, anything from barbershops to beauty shops, nurseries, someplace where you could keep your child while you went shopping. They offered bus service, shoe shining, everything. And in a way, department stores enthroned consumption as a route to democracy and citizenship, in that it invited everyone, regardless of race, class, gender, age, or country of origin, to enter, browse, and purchase. But even as they celebrated democracy, department stores, retail establishments of this level were in fact Jim Crow institutions, in that African American customers were often welcome to shop, but were usually provided unequal service. And they found their movements and participation in what would be the usual shopping experience severely constrained. In other words, they were routinely refused services, lunch counters, restaurants, and beauty shops. They were prohibited from trying on and returning clothes. They were denied credit and could arbitrarily refuse entrance or service at any moment. Some department stores, for example, would confine African American shoppers to their bargain basement, in believing, in part, to keep them out of view or from interacting with their targeted clientele, the white middle class, but also with the belief that African Americans couldn't afford to purchase the items that would be on the main floor or anywhere above. If you're an African American worker, you encountered the same rules of Jim Crow, and that they're only hired in menial jobs, right? Maids, janitors, cooks, elevator operators. Although you do see throughout the century before the civil rights movement a token few who were able to eventually move up to white collar jobs.
Shifting focus a bit, today's January 19. Yesterday was Martin Luther King Jr. Day. What do you want people to know about the civil rights movement in terms of its struggles and how this relates to our society today?
So I think there's a couple of points. I could go on for ages, let's be honest, but I won't. I think that oftentimes I say we meaning the public, right? The way in which Martin Luther King Day and even Black History Month is celebrated when we're thinking about the civil rights movement is that it helped dismantle racial segregation and discrimination in schools, housing, and in public accommodations. But a key part of that movement is that it really was a critique, an attack also on racial capitalism. And I say that because I'm thinking about Martin Luther King, and when I was a kid, Martin Luther King Day would come and you would listen to the radio. So we're talking about back in the 80s, and they would play I Have a Dream on the radio, and they would play Stevie Wonder's Happy Birthday, because that was written for Martin Luther King. But what no one told me as a child was the fact that towards the end of King's life is that he's very much concerned with economic discrimination, that he's concerned with trying to dismantle racial capitalism. And that really is, a lot of the ills and woes are very much grounded in this racialized capitalism, as well as a racialized democracy. And that is something that we are still combating. And that's certainly something that the Black Lives Matter movement has taken up. I also want people to remember that's very much tied to the Black Lives Matter movement, is that the civil rights movement wasn't just King. Right? King was a fabulous leader. He was a brilliant organizer. He was an eloquent speaker. But that movement was a movement of ordinary people. It was a movement of people who were willing to risk their lives every day. And we're talking about people who ranged in age from the age of 10 all the way through their 60s, 70s, and 80s. And that is what we're seeing once again, is a movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, I think with each passing year becomes even more multi-generational. And it's starting to speak to, I'm thinking, 5 years ago, I would say, I'm not quite sure my parents understood the Black Lives Matter movement. We're talking about folks in their 60s and 70s. Today, they have a better understanding and would consider themselves proponents, supporters, members of the Black Lives Matter movement. That's something that's very different. And I think that very much is reflective. It is a legacy of the civil rights movement.
Tomorrow, Joe Biden will be sworn in as the 46th president of the United States. Kamala Harris will be sworn in as vice president. What are some of the expectations and hopes that the African American community has for the BidenHarris administration? And if I could follow up with another question, if Mr. Biden were to ask you for one piece of advice, what would you share with him?
Wow, that's a large question. I've been thinking about that. There are many things that the African American community is concerned with. There's issues with certainly police brutality, the prison industrial complex, issues regarding public schooling, issues regarding the COVID-19 pandemic. There's many things that our community is faced with, that's being challenged with, and that frankly we're very, very concerned about. One piece of advice, there are better people than me who could give advice, I'm gonna be honest with you, but maybe based on the lessons of the civil rights movement, it has to do with listening to ordinary people. There are certainly key leaders within the community that you have to listen to, but to listen to the people on the ground, the people who are dealing every day with these issues, and to bring them in the fold and helping to solve these issues. Right? I think that would be one of the pieces of advice that I could think.
In your view, how can junior high schools, universities improve African American studies? And are you satisfied with the state of African American studies in the US today? Do you think the offerings need to change or increase? Or
It's interesting you asked that. What the 1776 Commission came out with its report. What was it, yesterday or the day before? Not in the past couple of days. No, I'm not satisfied. Yes, I think that there could be more. I think in some schools there needs to be some. In some school systems, periodic, every year, not only am I talking to other academics, but I'm also talking to high schoolers. I'm giving speeches for Black History Month, what have you. And in some school systems, there's a true absence of the African American experience or the diversity of the African American experience. And there's an absence of Black people outside of slavery. Like the story seems to stop at slavery. It might pick back up with Martin Luther King, but there isn't quite a comprehensive story of the role, the prominence, the function of race, but also the importance of African Americans in helping to build this nation, while at the same time being constantly undermined and constantly put in situations or having policies being put in place that has kept them as second-class citizens. This is why I think the 1619 Project is very important, right? It gives us other lenses, other ways of understanding the founding of the United States. It places African Americans as center in these stories, when oftentimes we are forgotten. My hope is that more and more projects like this happen, right? The 1619 Project is being currently taught in a variety of middle schools and high schools throughout the nation. My hope is that we have something that is similar for the 20th century that gets the same type of notoriety. There is the Charleston syllabus that does some of that work.
so I'm going to state the title of your book again. In addition to your book, Department Stores and the Black Freedom Movement, can you recommend for us another book about the civil rights movement that we may want to read?
So off the top, I'm teaching in like 2 weeks. So the book that comes to mind is actually At the Dark End of the Street by Danielle McGuire.
The Dark End of the Street?
At the Dark End of the Street by
Okay.
Danielle McGuire.
All right.
And this book focuses on the roles of African American women in the movement, not only in the civil rights movement, but also the Black Power movement. Okay. And I also would recommend Jean Theo Harris has a book, A More Beautiful and Terrible History, and the uses and misuses of civil rights history, that spotlights the way in which the civil rights movement has been politicized since its end, specifically starting in the 1980s and moving on, in ways that have been useful both to the Republican and Democratic parties.
What about a book on the history of slavery? Do you have a book that you can recommend? Anything that comes to mind?
Right now, what comes to mind is Tara Hunter's Bound in Wedlock, which examines slave families, slave marriages,
Okay.
actually during slavery and immediately after, during the Civil War.
Now, for us to learn more about these issues, can you recommend a podcast?
Oh, I wish that I don't have one off the top of my head.
That's fine. I just thought I'd throw it out there.
Thank you.
So you're an accomplished writer. A few questions that I like to ask of authors. Professor, when you write, where do you write?
I write in the room that I'm in now, which is one of our offices in the house. I prefer to write here if I'm in the mood to sit in a chair. But I find myself writing, honestly, sometimes all over the house, because sometimes you just need, depending on how long you have to write, a little change of scenery does not hurt. But primarily in the office.
And what time of the day or night do you write?
So I am a morning writer. I like to get up and try to get it done first thing, because then it just seems like it gets lost in the it's sort of, if you start with email, then that can take over your entire day. And then when I'm teaching, that can certainly take over. You get consumed with students. So I try to get it done in the morning. If I am energetic enough, or if we're like on winter break, I will do it like after 11 o'clock when my house has gone to sleep and it's quiet. So very late at night into the early hours, but primarily in the morning.
When you write, do you listen to background music or do you need quiet?
So it depends. I think it depends on what stage I am in the writing, right? So sometimes if I feel like I already have it at the surface, right, what I need to say and get out on the page, I'll listen to music. Sometimes writing can be more difficult on some days, right? And so getting out that one sentence might be a little harder, and so I need absolute quiet. But usually I think I'm usually listening to music. Now the music is all over the place. I think right now I've been listening to a lot of Bee Gees after watching the recent documentary. So,
Okay.
but yeah.
When you write, do you snack?
I do not snack. It's actually awful, because I can find, if it's a day that's clear, I can sit for 8 hours and look up and be like, I haven't eaten, which is, horrible. When I was in grad school, I would snack, and if you're a grad student, you should be careful, because you can gain much weight sitting there just writing and snacking all day.
Yeah. Do you drink anything when you write?
I usually have coffee and water nearby.
Okay. All right. Are there any books that you're currently reading?
So I'm currently reading 3, if that's right. It's weird. I kind of go between books. So I'm rereading Angela Davis's autobiography.
Hmm.
And I'm also reading a new book by Jane Daly, who's a professor out of the University of Chicago, called White Fright, which is about interracial sex in the 20th century. And I'm also reading a book called The Neighbor's Wife on lesbian relationships and marriage in the 20th century.
What projects are you working on? Do you have any plans for a new book?
So I'm writing a new book. Some of the readings that I'm doing are actually for that. I'm writing a book titled Beyond Loving, Love, Sex, and Marriage in the Black Freedom Movement. And so it's looking at African-American relationships, both those that were committed and uncommitted, those that were heterosexual, those that were queer, and the ways in which they were shaped by, but also helped shape the civil rights and Black power.
The book is Department Stores and the Black Freedom Movement by Professor Traci Parker. Professor, it was wonderful having you with us today. Thank you for doing this. Much continued success to you, and please keep healthy.
Thank you. You too.